For those who have not read these stories, the New York Times broke it, and the basic story has been confirmed by several other outlets while adding important new detail. The bounties being offered by Russia to these Taliban-linked militants are believed to have resulted in the deaths of several U.S. service members, maybe in 2018 or 2019. There's a couple specific incidents that are being looked at. The operation itself is run by a Russian military unit referred to as GRU Unit 29155, which we've actually talked about on the show before. They are known for conducting super aggressive operations in places like Europe. There was an assassination attempt against a former Russian military officer turned double agent in London. They tried to foment a coup in Montenegro to try to keep them out of NATO. So, basically
Right,
stuff
yeah.
the CIA did in the 50s. I mean, sort of getting here. But look, if true, this is a huge deal. It's a major escalation for Russia. And the evidence gets stronger and stronger. So U.S. and Afghan forces found $500,000 in U.S. currency in a Taliban outpost during a raid. These bounties were discussed during interrogations of captured Taliban members. And then on Tuesday, right before we started recording, the New York Times reported that U.S. intelligence found evidence of financial transfers from a Russian-controlled bank to a Taliban-linked account. So it sounds like this is pretty dead to rights. The initial controversy in Washington was about whether or not Trump was briefed on this, and we'll get to that. But let's start by talking about why Russia would do this and what the response would be. So, Ben, in terms of why would Russia do this, I've seen a couple theories. The first is that the bounties might be payback for a firefight with U.S. troops in Syria back in 2018 that killed a bunch of Russian mercenaries, killed a bunch of pro-Assad forces. Maybe this is, revenge. Others have speculated that the Russians might want to mess up the peace talks between the U.S. and the Taliban and the Afghan government, maybe keep us bogged down in Afghanistan longer, though, I don't know, these peace talks are kind of bogging themselves down. And I'm also just not sure there's any way you're going to convince Trump to keep troops in Afghanistan at this point. Just, Ben, you spent 8 years getting briefed on this stuff, learning about Putin's thinking, when and why he conducts external operations. What's your sense of why Russia might do something like this?
So I think there are two possibilities here, Tommy. One is tactical and one is kind of strategic. On the tactical basis, I think the Russians do have a view that the U.S. has provided support in Syria, for instance, to opposition elements that might have come into conflict with Russians. I remember in our last bilateral meeting with Vladimir Putin in 2016, he was complaining that we were not sufficiently separating out the opposition that we supported from some of the more extremist elements in Syria. He used colorful language to describe it, Tommy. He said, you have asked John Brennan to climb up a spruce tree naked without getting a scratch in his ass. Which is, which is something that...
Wait, was John in this meeting?
No, he wasn't. It was just me and Kerry and Susan and Obama.
What the...
But I do remember that.
Okay.
But so there is a possibility there. But I actually think the more likely point is that to understand Vladimir Putin, everything that guy does, I think, is about avenging kind of the humiliations that the Soviet Union and Russia felt at the collapse of the Soviet Union and in the 90s. And he's basically made it his political project to kind of avenge the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Mm-hmm. And he thinks that, not incorrectly, frankly, that the U.S. armed all of the Afghan mujahideen that fought against the Soviet Union in the 80s, and we kind of chased Russia out of Afghanistan with proxy forces that were killing their guys. And I think he's probably looking at this and thinking the U.S. is getting out of Afghanistan, so we're going to chase them out in the same way they did to us. Again, I have no basis for that other than my kind of instincts about what animates Putin. But to me, those two possibilities, that this is avenging, perhaps some losses of Russian personnel in Syria and avenging what happened to them in the 80s, would very much explain the mindset that could lead to this type of stuff.
Yeah, that honestly makes a lot of sense. Let's talk about what an appropriate response might look like, or what the range of responses could be. So we know that the administration did nothing, and that's a problem in and of itself. But they reportedly considered directly confronting Moscow. I imagine you could have Trump call Putin and say, "Knock it off." They considered sanctioning Russian officials involved in this operation. One thing I didn't see mentioned in the reporting, which seems like a pretty obvious first step, is coordinating whatever you do with NATO or with the British allies who are also targeted in this operation. I guess they did brief them, a week or so before this all leaked out. But if you're sitting in the Situation Room meeting, you hear about this kind of intelligence in these activities by the Russians. Well, like, what do you think the menu of possible options might look like, and what kind of things do you think make sense?
Well, I think, first of all, as soon as you saw this kind of explosive information, and I want to be very clear, just because Vladimir Putin may think he's justified in doing this doesn't mean that the United States should agree that that's a justification. There's no justification for harming U.S. troops ever, and certainly not from a party, Russia, that's not even in the Afghan conflict. I think the first thing is the President of the United States would pick up the phone and say, what the hell are you doing? We are aware of these reports. If you don't cut this out, there's a range of consequences that we can employ, and deliver a very stern warning. And what are those consequences? They can range from the United States, imposing additional sanctions on Russia, on any entities that we can identify that have anything to do with this. They can frankly be warnings that, if Russia goes down this slippery slope, that perhaps Russian forces that are in hotspots like Syria and Ukraine, could be put in danger, and you can be ambiguous about that. And again, I'm not saying we should do that, but that's, again, you asked about the menu. I think you go to your allies and say, hey, this is not just us. This is, apparently British troops too. We might need to do something coordinated around sanctions in response to this. But, ideally, you'd throw a brushback pitch that just indicated that there's a lot of stuff you could do, and you can be vague about it too, because there's cyber things that we can do, and see if that has the impact. Another important thing here, Tommy, we've talked a lot about the Taliban peace deal. Well, they're involved in this too, and so I think you go to the Taliban and say, peace deal's off if you guys keep talking to the Russians, full stop. And if you want to be in these peace negotiations, then you got to tell all your goons to cut it out with the Russians. And so we could come at it from that direction too, as a force protection matter for our troops. So there's things you can do here to try to brush us back to both the Russians and the Taliban. And what's clear is none of that is being done because Trump doesn't seem to care.
Last point on this, the big fight in Washington is about whether Trump was briefed on this intelligence or not. I mean, these guys are liars, so I don't even know why we bother entertaining this conversation. But a bunch of outlets have reported that he was briefed, that this information was in Trump's presidential daily briefing, or his PDB, which is the most sensitive intelligence product in the government that you're supposed to get every day. But it sounds like maybe he was given a written piece of paper with the intelligence. He never actually reads the intel, and he gets the verbal briefing once or twice a week, so he didn't hear it in the PDB process. But the Associated Press reported that both John Bolton and his current national security advisor briefed him on it as far back as March 2019. So, I don't know. It doesn't seem like anyone believes that this intelligence is a hoax. Maybe there's a dispute among intelligence agencies about the strength or veracity of the information, and we get into this a little bit with Adam Schiff later. But stepping back, I mean, when there's a dispute like this, right, and let's say there's a piece of intelligence and the NSA says this is credible, but the CIA says we're not so sure this is right. How does that get refereed? And who makes the call about whether or not to give it to the President of the United States or maybe caveat it if you do?
So first of all, I've never seen a cover story fall apart so quickly, Tommy, because they came out and said, no, this was never briefed. And then in the New York Times report yesterday, they had dated intelligence products, right? So they said, no, this was in this PDB on this date in February. This was in this wire report, CIA wire report, which I'll come back to later in the spring. This was in these interrogation reports of captured Taliban. And just to break this down for people, the PDB is a written document, right, that goes to the president every day. So if it was in the date that they said, that means that Donald Trump was given this information in writing. The wire that they mentioned, this is an intelligence kind of collection of articles that is literally disseminated to thousands of people in the government.
Yeah.
You got it, Tommy. I mean, a lot of people get this. And so this is pretty wide. The receipts would have been not just a very small number of people. They're out there. And what's clear to me is that people in the intelligence community, and I have no idea who they are, I learn about this in the New York Times like everybody else, but that they saw these denials and they're like, wait a second, this is bullshit. You guys are just flat out lying. This stuff was briefed to Trump in his written PDB. Not our fault if he didn't fucking read it. This was briefed to a lot of people at the White House, a lot of people across the government, and it's your fault for not doing anything with that. It's not our fault. We warned you, and that's very common to the intelligence community to do. The second thing I'd say is there are always disputes. And it's not disputes, by the way. This doesn't mean people are fighting about it. It means that intelligence is developed in certain parts of the U.S. national security apparatus. So it might have started with, I don't know, as the report suggested, Navy SEALs out in Afghanistan hear something. And then you try to match that against intercepts. And then you try to match that against other human intelligence. And yes, in that process, you develop higher and higher degrees of confidence that something is true. But it was very common that the President of the United States, when I was there, and I was in the PDB and got it for 7 years, that the President would constantly get reports that were not fully resolved amongst agencies. You don't sit on potentially explosive national security information because you want to sit around and wait like 7 months to piece together a Rubik's Cube of all the different agencies. So this also is a bogus effort to throw sand in the gears of this story. And it has nothing to do with whether or not the core thing is right, which is that we got this intelligence. It was briefed up the chain. It was briefed to the president. It was briefed to his national security team. And they apparently chose to do nothing about the fact that they knew that there were these dangers to the lives of U.S. service members when that's their highest obligation as commander-in-chief or national security advisor. That's the heart of this scandal, not, what form the information was briefed on or how many intelligence agencies signed on to it. That's just a smokescreen for them to try to avoid the necessary accountability here.
Yeah, it is an extraordinary dereliction of duty. I am glad that people like General Mattis and Colin Powell and other, former senior military leaders have come out and denounced Trump for being racially divisive. I would think that a story like this would be a moment when other leaders might come forward and say, if the president of the United States can't act on intelligence this clear to defend U.S. service members that he sent to Afghanistan. Remember, he increased the force level over in Afghanistan. He's directly responsible for them being there. That is a dereliction of duty. You do not deserve to ever set foot in that office again. There should be hearings. We should vote his ass out. I mean, if we hadn't already impeached him, I'd recommend that. This is an extraordinary bit of reporting. And I just wanted to emphasize that because we obviously talk about Trump a lot on the show. Frankly, we've been trying to dial all the Trump stuff back. But something like this is just so unbelievable is maybe the only word I can really conjure for it, that I, just wanted to emphasize it over again.
Well, look, if his best defense is he doesn't read his intelligence briefings, that's the best he can do. Like, then he shouldn't be commander-in-chief. And by the way, he didn't read his briefings about COVID too. And look where that got us. Tens of thousands of additional deaths because he moved slow. If he doesn't care about our troops and look, even if you take the most generous version of this, he still was briefed about this a few days ago and has still done nothing or said nothing. And in fact, he said it was a hoax. So he's still done nothing to help protect our troops from harm's way. And frankly, I would think that the Trump voters, right? People who care about the troops, people who care about this kind of hard-edged patriotism. Frankly, people who went along with a phony Benghazi scandal for years that was predicated on the notion that we didn't do enough to protect people in harm's way and then weren't forthcoming about it. Again, I think that was a bullshit charge for reasons that we don't have to fully unpack here. This is 100 times worse than that, particularly if we've learned from these reports that troops might have died. And the last thing, Tommy, is, it can be, people can roll their eyes about the Russia stuff, but since this information was moving around the highest levels of the White House, he's invited Vladimir Putin to the G7 here in the United States. He's announced a withdrawal of U.S. forces from Germany, something we talked about, benefits nobody except Russia. It's hard to get around the really chilling reality that he just doesn't seem to want to do anything that could in any way complicate his relationship with Vladimir Putin.